Good morning, everyone. I'm Asha Nayaswami. We're continuing our conversations about the masters of this path of self-realization. This is about our third or fourth day talking about Paramhansa Yogananda. I don't know if it'll be our last or not. We'll see what happens. So let's pray together. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master, Paramhansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to attune ourselves to your inward presence, to receive your wisdom, your guiding spirit. We are deeply sincere in our desire to live in harmony with your will. Make your will known to us, and then give us the clarity and the courage, the willpower and the love to live in harmony with thy will. Om. Peace. Amen. I've been trying to think of various aspects of Master's teaching. I mean, we talk about Yogananda all the time, so it's not as if nothing is known about him. So I've been trying to think about various things that will help attune us, particularly to be able to live properly as disciples. And I was remembering um, in this book, Light Bearer, which many of you know, and if you don't know it, I encourage you to read it. It's on page 173 in the year 1982. And you can, if you want to read more about what I'm saying, you can find it in here. I was thinking about the fact that an avatar is called to earth because there is a longing that goes forward. Because if there's no receptivity to the avatar's presence, there's no point in coming. They have no need to impose. It's a partly I've been talking a lot about the Himalayan masters sort of guiding the destiny of the planet. So on one hand, you have the evolution of the yugas, which is what we're in right now, especially moving from Kali Yuga into Dwapara Yuga. So you have the evolution of the yugas, which requires divine intervention in order to bring that about in the right way. But you also have to have a sincere longing from some group of disciples, some group of devotees who are calling for the master to come. In not in Autobiography of Yogi, in the Festival of Light, it says, a prayer of love went up from earth and you responded. A ray of your light flashed out from the heart of infinity, burst downward through night skies of consciousness, and was born on earth for the redemption of mankind in human form. We're talking about the descent of an avatar in its true meaning, which is a God-realized master who takes human form. A prayer of love went up from earth and you responded. If there's no prayer of love going up from earth, then there's not going to be a divine response. So you can look at Master's life from many different angles. But one of the interesting parts of his life, of course, is that he spent almost all of it in America. In 1920, he was born in 1893. So when he was 27 years old, he got on a boat in India, and it was now like, it'll be 100 years ago this September. We're having celebrations to commemorate it. He comes across the ocean. He lands in Boston. He lived in America until his passing in 1952, except in 1935, Sri Yukteswar was going to leave his body, and he called Yogananda back, inwardly called him back. So Master went to India for a little over a year at that period of time. But all the rest of his life he spent in America. And all of his teachings, and when he was in India for that year and a half, he did move around and teach, and he helped put on a solid foundation the roots that he'd planted there, primarily his school and the Dakshineshwar Center. I mean, he did some things to support the disciples like Tulsi Bose and others who'd been carrying on that work. But the majority of his life and all of his writings, they were all done in the context of talking to Americans. So everything is oriented in that way. Um, well, there was things to say about India, but he never wrote and worked separately in India at all. He just went back, gave them his consciousness, helped organize, brought in some American money from Rajasi, but then more or less left it on its own. And so, Autobiography of a Yogi, Whispers from Eternity, Science of Religion, all of his precepta lessons, all of the lectures, all of the recordings. I mean, I'm trying to think, actually, I don't think we have any tangible teachings that came out of that year and a half in India. All of the tangible teachings, his commentary on the Gita, his commentary on the Bible, the SRF magazines, just everything was done here in this consciousness. And of course, Master was beyond all influences, normal influences of culture and predisposition and so on. But nonetheless, when you're offering a teaching like this, you have to offer it into the consciousness that will accept it. So he oriented his teachings very much for the American mind. Um, when Master talks about when he first landed in Boston, or maybe it's Swami who describes it this way, but Master spent, I think it might have been as long as 2 years, but certainly a year or two, just getting used to America, just sort of learning English better and figuring out where he was, and just tuning into what the consciousness here is. I'm going to just take a little turn over here because it's interesting. At a certain point, Swami had a dream in the last decade of his life. I'm not sure when, maybe it was earlier. It's very intriguing, and it relates to this in a fun way. He had a dream, and the way Swami told it to us, I think it was a superconscious dream, and I think it was a true experience. In his dream, a delegation arrived, and they were from another planet. And they needed a spiritual teacher there. They needed an avatar. They needed a prophet to come. And they wanted Swami Kriyananda to come to their planet and help them because they needed someone to set the tone and teach them. And who knows, they'd found him. And he said they were very sincere and their need was great. And he was very tempted to go with them. I mean, what I never asked Swami is, would he have died, in this world, or would he have just done both worlds at the same time? Since in the end he didn't go, we'll never know. But he said he was just beginning to feel such compassion for these people that he was ready to go. And then he realized, and this is how Swami put it, ah, a new language, a new culture. He said so much to adjust to. So I had to tell them no, that I couldn't face it. And I thought about Swami, learning the European languages or going to India as a young man and learning some Bengali and some Hindi and then having to be in America and learn how Americans relate. He couldn't do it again. So when he talked about Master coming to America and just getting used to the culture, because Americans our own reality. We're our own vibration in the cosmos. It's not like, I live in America and I have many American characteristics, but my soul, the jiva that inhabits this body, has no gender, no culture, no ethnicity, none of those things. But as long as I live here, let me phrase it differently, but these karmic groups exist. And so what it is from the astral world, those we choose a karmic group to be part of, which gives us family, culture, language, and also the karma of that karmic group. And we step into it because it's an appropriate place for the jiva to learn. So I was talking in the last few days about Alfonso X and how the law system that he set up in Spain ends up influencing America. And of course, England was the source of how America began. And there is this Dwapara Yuga nature about America. It really is. The USA is a Dwapara Yuga country, as I was saying from the Declaration of Independence. But anybody could come to this country, and it doesn't matter. You don't have to be a landed aristocrat. It's taken us time to make the ideal show, but you can be nobody. And then, well, recently, President Obama is a mixed race person whose family was nobody. They were absolutely nobody. And he became the president of the United States. I mean, we take that for granted. And the whole world moving into Dwapara Yuga begins to think this way. But it was extraordinarily radical. So the whole of the United States was part, I believe, of this flow of energy that was necessary to set the stage for this. Bear in mind, the masters sit at the center of the hub of wheel of time, and past, present, and future just spin, and they set things in motion, and their sense of time is exceedingly different. I even asked Swami at one point, because the founding of America is a very inspiring story, and there's many very noble, self-sacrificing souls who were the founders of this country, and it's very inspiring to read about them. And at different times, I've become enamored of it and read. I'm no historian, but I've read a few books, popular history books. And I said to Swamiji, I said, doesn't it seem probable that key people who are part of Master's work helped found this country, since America, the USA, it has been so important in the spread of Master's mission of self-realization? It seems probable that we were involved. And I said, I certainly feel an attunement with it. I don't have a memory of it, but I feel like it's the kind of thing I would have wanted to do. About our involvement, in principle, the divine inspiration behind the founding of the USA as being part of the way that the masters were influencing history, Swami took that to be self-evident. And it's very interesting that many of the founding fathers felt themselves to be on a mission from God. They were not necessarily conventional religious people, but the spiritual impetus behind what they were doing, because they risked everything, because the USA won. You don't necessarily understand. A person doesn't necessarily know how dangerous it was, what they did, and how these highly established people risked everything, life, property, freedom, everything, in order to do this, because it was treason against one of the most powerful nations in the world, and it would not be treated lightly. But we won. I say we, the USA won, and so it turned out differently, even though they were persecuted, and some of them did have great difficulties in their life because of what they did. Now, the end of all of that is that then Master comes, and even in Autobiography of a Yogi, as I've mentioned earlier in these discussions, Master has the vision in the storeroom of the schoolhouse. He sees these Western faces, and he declares these are Americans. And then he just goes right to America, because he knew this is where he was going to be. So and then the other part of it is, because of the nature of the USA and the democratic system and the equality of humanity and the freedom of religion, and the fact that we're a baby country. And we're a baby country in ways that one doesn't really think about until you go to cultures that aren't baby cultures. I didn't travel outside the US until I was in my mid-30s, and my first trip was to Europe, and I traveled with Swamiji, and we went to Italy. Italy is what impressed me the most in this respect. Because I'd never been there, Swami wanted to make sure that I saw the art in Florence and things like that. And I was in Florence, and I was looking at the David, the beautiful statue by Da Vinci, by Michelangelo. And I met Florentine Italians because of Swamiji, and they were all extremely proud of being Florentines, because after all, their city was the city of Michelangelo and all of this great art, and you could look around and see all the greatness that was Florence, and you could see in them there was this, I am great too, because my family is from Florence. And later on, I went to India, of course, which is an even older culture, and just everything is ancient. And there's this, you go to Varanasi, and as I talked about Varanasi when I was talking about Lahiri Mahashaya, and people don't even know how old Varanasi is. It's old beyond imagination of expectancy for us to be able to define it. And there is this, again, I am part of this ancient culture. As an American, it was so startling to me. And I realized, like fish swimming in water, that I was swimming in water. We have a history, but our history is mostly an embarrassment. Worse than an embarrassment, our history is a tragedy. You know, we enslaving people in order to build our economy, stealing completely from the indigenous people, eliminating their culture totally. It's not a lot to be proud of. Now, there are many other aspects of the can-do spirit. We're here, we're going to make this country, and the eventual courage of the revolution itself, the American Revolution. So everything is a mix in this world. And Swamiji often says, merely because there is the presence of darkness everywhere does not mean that darkness is present in the same proportion everywhere. It's a very subtle and very important thought. So even though one can say that there are dark places in American history, that does not make American history dark. And it does not make the country dark, because there are also enormous positive qualities. So we have to be balanced and not become foolish in our attempt to right wrongs, because then we just push the pendulum the other way. So we have this power. Oh, so I realized when I saw the contrast, and realized that in the U.S. you have to look forward, and part of the fundamental nature of the U.S. is what has been done before me, either by my ancestors or my predecessors, does not make me a valuable person. I mean, that's the whole principle of the American way of life, is that I am who I am, and I can be anything I want. And the fact that people before me did something special counts, but not very much. It's just sort of, maybe it gives you money, and maybe in certain very small circles it will give you a certain status, but you don't automatically get anything. You're not a lord, you're not a peer, you're not a count. You're just what you are, and what you see is what you get. And again, the other side of it is we're always looking forward here. So that's why we're very open to new things. That's why the USA is a core place for enormous innovation. Even from generation to generation, young people go and live away from their parents. And that has a negative quality, but it also has an exceedingly positive quality. You see, everything is a mixture, because a young person starting out in life is not bound by what came before him, and is not trapped by the expectation of the former generation, or the self-definition that generation has imposed upon him. And you see how marvelous all these qualities are for self-realization, how perfect they are for self-realization. And then there's another aspect of the USA which is really interesting, which is we start religions over here. I mean, I remember when Ananda went to Europe, and went to Italy especially. We had been in this lawsuit in America for years to win the right to call ourselves Ananda Church of Self-Realization. We were about halfway through that incredible lawsuit, millions of dollars, a tremendous amount of effort put into it. Swami had begun to travel in Italy. He'd begun to think about India. I mean, he'd begun to really start Ananda in Italy, because this was by the 90s, and Italy started 10 years prior to that. Ananda, Italy is what I mean. And so we're sitting, this was one of those wonderful moments in time. We're sitting at the lunch table with our attorney, John Parsons, and Naidruva, who was our attorney. And we're just, we're eyebrow deep in this effort to win the right to call ourselves Ananda Church of Self-Realization. And Swami says, church is really not a very good word. He said, in Italy and Europe, it doesn't make any sense at all. People think church means Catholic Church, and they can't understand the word. And of course, in India, it's a colonial term. The concept of church reminds them of when they were oppressed by the English. I don't really think it's a good word for us at all. He said, I think we should call ourselves Sangha, which is what we did eventually, meaning fellowship. And I remember John Parsons, who was so masterful because he was such a good attorney and he was such a good friend. We all just sort of got this stricken look on our faces. And nobody really knew what to say because, of course, he was making perfect sense. And I will just add, Swami was so flexible. He was just so flexible. He lived in the now. He just looked at things as they were. So we all kind of just sit there with a stricken look on our face. Finally, John Parsons recovers first. Well, sir, he said, he was always very respectful. Sir, I can certainly understand. Those are very good points, but why don't we finish what we're doing and win the right to use the word, and then we can decide whether or not we will. And everybody went, like this. And we went on like that. But when we were here in the Palo Alto area and in 1994, we had the opportunity, which we took, to buy what had been St. Aloysius Catholic Church. And it's beautifully located, and it's the wonderful building that we have been in ever since. It's just absolutely marvelous. As it happens, when we were negotiating and we were in escrow and we were purchasing that, some friends from Italy, our Ananda group in Italy, were visiting. And again, many things happen around the lunch table. We're sitting around the lunch table, and not all of them spoke English at all, and even those who did not speak it necessarily fluently. So communication, well, actually, there must have been one or two who spoke well enough because they could translate. But we were just talking about buying this church. It was St. Aloysius Catholic Church. It was going to be our church, Ananda Church of Self-Realization, like this. And the Italians are kind of, I couldn't understand their language. Finally, their spokesperson says, "We do not understand. Catholics do not sell their churches." It was just like they keep them forever. The entire concept that a church building would be bought and sold and just become another denomination, it was utterly incomprehensible to them. And even the idea that we, Ananda, were a church, they just could not absolutely understand it at all. And when I've had to explain to Indians or to Europeans that, there was, that Ananda was sued, and the way I often explain it is, when a religion starts in America, it starts with the first church of. The first church of, the holy burning bush, the first church of, the prophet from the mountain. And the first church of gets to start. And then for a long time, it's not called the first church of, it's just called the church of. But then invariably, and almost always, either there's somebody is expelled, somebody's kicked out for being a heretic, or somebody leaves in a huff as a heretic. Swami Kriyananda was expelled, but suddenly he finds himself on the outside, having been declared by the church of a heretic. However, not seeing himself as a heretic, but seeing himself as a valid disciple who wants to be part of the church of, he starts the second church of. And then the first church of, having persuaded itself that it is the only church of, then makes some effort to snuff out the second church of. I mean, this is not new now. In present day, we use the courts. In the past, they would just throw you into prison. That's where St. John of the Cross spent a lot of time in prison. St. Teresa of Avila had a pretty hard time because they were reforming the Carmelite order. It wasn't the church of, but it was the second Carmelite order. And the first did not want to be reformed. And so they put you in prison, or they tried to starve you or torture you or beat you. So we were really fortunate because we were just in court. That was all that happened. But when I tried to explain this to Europeans or to Indians, the whole premise, you start a church, it's just like, where do you put such an idea? But in the US, you can start a church. And people make fun of us because, yeah, anybody can start a church. I'm the church of the great apricots, or whatever you want to call it. And nowadays, nowadays you can sign up on the internet and do a few questions, and then you get an ordination certificate, and you're legal to do marriages as part of the church of. I don't object to any of that because that's the way we move. That's the way we do things. But you see what a perfect setting it was? Because otherwise, I mean, if Master had tried to start in Europe, He couldn't, I mean, it's been a problem for our work over there is that we can't be perceived as a religion. We've gradually gotten ourselves into a position because of litigation also that happened there. But people don't have a mindset where a prophet, you know, we in the U.S. we didn't have the concept of an avatar, but we did have the concept of a prophet, a seer, because we have all these churches that have been started by somebody. So Master could just walk into this environment with this new message, this new spiritual message, and people understood that he was a prophet with a new message. And then he gradually incorporated, as you do, to make it look like something, to bring what you're doing to some kind of a discernible focus. He brought what he was doing to a discernible focus, and he called it self-realization. And you know, when we were in litigation, the impetus for the litigation was actually a move by Swami Kriyananda himself in January of 1990. We had called Ananda, it had countless names up until that point. Not countless, but we could count them all. But we'd had a number of different names. It was always the Ananda something. And in January of 1990, Swami said, we are self-realizationists. That was what our guru said. Our guru came, he declared that he was bringing a new dispensation, a new expression of ancient teachings. He called it self-realization. And Swami says, as disciples, it's not only, and this is an important point, it's not only that we have a right to be self-realizationists, we have a duty to be self-realizationists, because otherwise we're not following our guru's teachings. We're making up something of our own. Now, of course, that did not go down well with the first church of, but nonetheless, we held to it, and it was supported by American law, because in the USA, freedom of religion is fundamental. So it was perfectly possible for Master to arrive as this prophet from India. I mean, and visualize him, think about it. This was way long before globalization. The only way to come across from India was weeks and weeks on a boat. And Master wore his hair long, and he gradually began to wear American business dress most of the time. But when he first arrived, he would walk around in his orange robe. And Dr. Lewis and Mrs. Lewis talk about this small Massachusetts town. And even now, those of us who live in California, when you go back to the East Coast, it's just a more, many areas of it are still, I would only say, surprisingly conservative. Not all of it, but so you think of this small Massachusetts town, and Mrs. Lewis talks about this man dressed from head to toe in orange. I mean, just start there. Like, how many men at all walk around dressed in orange? We're talking in 1922, this dark-skinned man with long hair, dressed from head to toe in orange, is walking across the village green. Her first thought was not, you know, this is the second coming of Jesus Christ. Her first thought was, who? It's this weird, impossible person. And in fact, it took some time. Dr. Lewis immediately recognized Master, but it took a little time and effort for him to persuade his wife, who he could see. But here he was in the US, and he could do it. He could just stand up and say, I have a message from God. It's a new message. It's a new spirituality. This is what we're going to do. Now, I'm going to say just a little bit more, just a tiny bit more. No, actually, I'm not. I'm going to save it for next time. But Master's powerful statement that this was a teaching that was true to the ancient wisdom, but was a new expression of it, also became a vitally important part of his message. Now, as it turns out, I did not get to the year 1982 in the book Light Bearer. So the next time I talk, I'll start there. God bless you.